Hey, class. Good afternoon. Yeah, when I'm recording this is in the afternoon, but maybe you're watching this, who knows when it is. But welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. Last chapter, we kind of explored, very sort of introductory to the textbook ways of conceptualizing adjustment and thinking about using the textbook and what adjustment, all those important sort of foundational things were set forth in chapter 1. So if you haven't watched that yet, definitely go back. Now we're moving forward and looking at chapter 2, which is theories of personality, which for many of you, if you've taken intro psych recently, a lot of this will be familiar, but it's sort of taking what you've probably already, maybe been exposed to in intro psych or maybe AP psych or somewhere else and kind of framing it within the realm of adjustment. So the first sort of, set of first topic we're going to look at is just what personality is, or the nature of personality. So again, these learning objectives are things that you should be able to do by the time either you finish reading the textbook, this chapter, or by the time you finish watching this video. Hopefully you're doing both. Don't use these videos to replace the textbook. So you should be able to clarify the meaning of personality and personality traits, and describe the 5-factor model of personality and how it relates to the big 5 traits, life outcomes. So personality, we think about it in terms of like how we respond, how we respond to the world around us, but our textbook kind of is a little more specific. It's an individual's unique constellation of consistent behavioral traits. So it's your consistent pattern of behaving, thinking, responding, reacting, and each individual has a different kind of personality under this, this very broad umbrella term we call personality. And ultimately, I think, and if we try to understand like individual differences, human beings, biologically speaking, we are so incredibly similar. We're like 99.999% similar, or some number like that. But why are we all so unique and different? Well, I think from a psychological standpoint, it comes to differences in personality. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at, how, the differences in how each of us adjust to the world around us. And these are, so we're going to explore different theories for kind of understanding, how people adjust to the world around them. So one of the ways that psychologists try to understand personality is by breaking it down into traits. And these are sort of dispositions, and given situations, or in a particular situation or particular setting, we might predict an individual to behave or respond accordingly. So for example, somebody who is more extroverted in terms of that personality trait, maybe we would expect them to be more outgoing in a crowd of people, a room full of strangers, versus an introvert, maybe not so much. So we'll look at some of the terms that psychologists use for describing personality, but some other terms that, we probably use in our everyday way of speaking, referring to someone as honest, as moody, impulsive, friendly, any sort of adjective you might use to describe someone. Typically, we're thinking about it in terms of personality traits. And one of the most recent theories on personality and personality traits comes from McCrae and Costa's Big 5 personality, or the Big 5 theory of personality. And basically, we can think about differences in individuals and how we adjust to the world around us in terms of these 5 traits. You have extraversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And hopefully these terms are somewhat familiar to you. Extraversion typically refers to like how outgoing you are. Neuroticism refers to the stability of your emotions. Openness to experience, just like it sounds. Do you like to try new things? Agreeableness, how well do you get along with others? Conscientiousness, in terms of like how organized are you? So this is of course is one of the more this is probably the dominant perspective in terms of personality, but it's not the only one, and that's what we're going to be looking at going forward. And this is the cluster, kind of what you might imagine it visually. And if it helps, you can actually you can rearrange the letters to spell either canoe or ocean if you need some kind of memory or mnemonic device to help you remember the big 5 traits. Another perspective, probably one of the oldest perspectives when it comes to personality, comes from Freud, the psychodynamic perspective. So by the end of this section, you should be able to explain Freud's view on personality, identify key defense mechanisms, summarized the psychodynamic theories of Adler and Jung, who followed in the footsteps of Freud, evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach. So anytime we see psychodynamic, we're pretty much always talking about Freud or neo-Freudians, people who followed in his footsteps. But this model or theory derives from the work of Sigmund Freud. And the idea is that our personality is shaped by unconscious mental forces, especially in childhood. The way unconscious wishes, desires, the unconscious portion of our mind where those wishes and desires go, this kind of vast reservoir of the mind that we're not even aware of. And the major theorist, of course, obviously Freud, but some of his followers are Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. Obviously not an exhaustive list, but those are names you might hear frequently when you hear about psychodynamic theory. Freud thought about, his theory of personality is quite controversial. It's one of the most debated forms of theory to this extent. It's not really a scientific theory in any sense of the word, but it's still a really interesting one. Freud believed that our personality is governed by the unconscious portion of our mind, the portion of our mind that we're not aware of and that we can't control. He talked about the importance of childhood experience shaping our adult personality, which is one of the things that really has stood the test of times in Freudian theory. Is childhood does matter a lot. We do know that's true. And 3, personalities are shaped by the manner in which an individual copes with their sexual urges as they develop. Now, when Freud talked about sex, it isn't always necessarily referring to sex as in like the act of having sex by yourself or with another person. Freud a lot of times referred to sex purely as the release of energy, but obviously anytime you see that word thrown around, it's going to invoke a lot of controversial thoughts and imagery and things like that. So probably 1 and 3 are pretty debatable. 2, we can say Freud probably hit the nail on the head. He also talked about how our personality is broken up into 3 distinct structures. And this is and these structures develop as we age. And when we're first initially born, our personality is dominated by what Freud called the id. It is the pleasure. It operates from the pleasure principle. Like, I want things and I want them now. It's very instinctual. And again, it's, like when a baby is first born, I mean, they when they're hungry, they're not waiting on mom and dad to get done doing what they're doing. They'll scream and cry until they're fed. And Freud would say this is the id, acting up on this very, very sort of pleasure instinctual principle. The ego over time develops as well. This is the reality principle, kind of understanding, okay, maybe I do want things, but every now and then I sometimes have to wait. And this is more of like the decision-making process of our personality. And of course, this takes time to develop. This isn't something that children are born with right away. And then finally, superego is our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong. This is learned, by exposure to parents, exposure to caregivers, but it develops over time. And so the structure of our personality develops as we kind of go through unique stages of personality. So the id, the ego, superego are also kind of distributed what Freud called the layer of awareness or layers of our consciousness. We have the conscious layer, which is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. It's the thing that we are most aware of right now. Like right now, you're probably aware of, you can hear my voice, you can see me on screen. That would be your conscious awareness. Pre-conscious awareness would be, things that are maybe just right outside of your mental awareness. And maybe once you kind of direct your attention to them, you can easily bring them to conscious attention. Like right now, I've for the most part have ignored the fact that my fan above me, the sound of the fan. But now that I'm thinking about it, the oscillation of the fan a moment ago was in my pre-conscious awareness. I knew it was there, but I was not obviously thinking about it. But now that I'm talking about it and even showing you my fan, you can clearly tell that it's moved from pre-conscious to conscious. But according to Freud, the most difficult aspect is kind of tapping into this unconscious portion of our mind. This is where we store wishes, desires, things that maybe aren't always societally or, acceptable, and things that may cause us shame or doubt or things like that. And we kind of, they get put in this reservoir that Freud called the unconscious mind that has a tremendous influence on our behavior. And this is kind of visually what this kind of represents. And you can even see how the id, the ego, the superego all kind of map out. According to Freud, this stuff below the surface, deep below the surface, is what really drives the bus in terms of behavior, in terms of personality. So, Freud believed that in terms of understanding behavior, in terms of understanding personality, we're dealing with these kind of internal conflicts between the id, ego, and superego, and how we resolve those conflicts is a reflection of our personality. These conflicts originate from sexual and aggressive urges, especially, as we continue to work through, as we progress, through developmental stages. These conflicts might lead to anxiety, and according to Freud, unconsciously, we might exhibit defense mechanisms. These are reactions, especially to intense emotions like anxiety, guilt, shame, things like that. And I'm not going to go over all of these, but these are examples of defense mechanisms. For example, we might repress, we might engage in repression when we're very stressed or very experiencing high intensity shame, things like that. The example says a traumatized soldier has no recollection of their details of a close brush with death. Basically, you repress the memory. It's so traumatic, it's so scary, you don't even want to think about it anymore. Regression is, when you revert to a more immature state, so an adult having a temper tantrum, kind of like a child. And again, so all of these, this is not an exhaustive list, but make sure you read over the textbook. And according to Freud, these are reflections of conflict that maybe have gone unresolved, probably from childhood, probably from an earlier stage of development. So, Freudian theory dominated psychology for many years, but mostly has been found to be unscientific and mostly only interesting to read about, not necessarily always the most, scientific application of psychology. So some more recent studies have found that these defense mechanisms, for example, when people when they experience stress or any kind of perceived threat to self, you're more likely to engage in behaviors that are considered defense mechanisms. They are intended to protect yourself, especially from emotional stress, shame, guilt, things like that. They correlate with impairments in mental health. And, people who are repressing their memories may be showing signs of an impoverished memory for events that trigger unpleasant emotions. So there are some support necessarily for what's happening, kind of as that way we protect ourselves, maybe not necessarily for the same mechanics that Freud thought. There's not a whole lot of evidence that the id, ego, or superego are at play. We don't really know what does that mean scientifically. So in terms of personality development, Freud believed that, we go through, we develop the elements of our adult personality basically from birth till about age 5. And later on, we have these 5 different stages of development that he called the psychosexual stage. And each stage we have a conflict, or we have a sexual urge, a release of energy that we're trying to overcome. And according to Freud, if we don't resolve the conflict at each stage, we could develop what's called fixation, where we kind of fail to move forward, at least developmentally, and we might, be kind of fixated on one particular stage instead of going to the other. And each stage is described by an erogenous zone. So, for example, stage 1 is called the oral stage because when children are first born, from about 0 to 1 years old, everything revolves around the mouth. For example, children are fed, via breastfeeding or given a bottle. They are also, when they're exploring the world around them, one of the first things children do is they pick up an object and they put it in their mouth. So everything evolves around the mouth. And according to Freud, for example, if a child, if their needs are not being met at this stage, if some kind of conflict is not resolved at this stage, children can develop what's called an oral fixation. And this might look like somebody biting their nails or chewing on things or smoking cigarettes later in life. So this is where the theory gets kind of interesting and unscientific, but each stage is kind of associated with a different erogenous zone and a different conflict to arise and different kind of developmental task that the child is trying to overcome. So this should be familiar from intro psych, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over every single stage, but this is kind of what Freud means when he talks about development and how it relates to personality and how we adjust to the world. So how we adjust to the world is dependent upon, according to Freud, how we resolve each one of these stages. So in this stage, this is a depiction of the oral stage, children learning trust and their caregivers, especially through that act of bonding of breastfeeding and even bottle feeding as well. Jung was a follower, a neo-Freudian. He was a big believer in this idea of the unconscious mind. He kind of differed from Freud. He didn't put as much emphasis on sex, as Freud did, but he also talked about the unconscious mind kind of at two levels. We have the personal unconscious mind, which is very similar to what Freud talked about, that part of the mind that's very influential on our behavior that maybe we're not even aware of. But there's also the collective unconscious, and this is kind of this storehouse of memories that all human beings sort of share because we've had this collective experience of being humans. And it explains why, for example, we see a lot of the same themes of dreams popping up in different cultures, different times and places. So it's taking that consciousness or that unconsciousness and taking it one step further and looking at how it influences all of us. So it's not just memories of distinct personal experiences, but it's more of like a cultural memory, and we use this collective unconscious to develop archetypes, and these archetypes will continue to show up throughout the stories we tell and things like that. So for example, like the hero, we see that like any story you tell, like a movie or a book you read, especially if we're talking about fiction, a lot of times there's sort of thematically this archetype of a hero character, and we see themes and archetypes like that pop up across cultures, across times, through symbols, art, literature, religion, things like that. And that's kind of what Jung was tapping into or talking about when he talks about the collective unconscious rather than the personal. Adler, also a neo-Freudian, he did not believe that sexuality was the most important drive, but rather trying to feel superior or avoid feeling inferior. So we might engage in behaviors that compensate when we feel inferior. We might do things that try to overcome that sense of inferiority and really display our abilities of superiority. So if we're unsuccessful in those attempts, according to Adler, we might develop what is called an inferiority complex, where there's a sort of exaggerated feeling like you're just not good enough, and this leads people to overcompensate to kind of to overcome those perceived inferiorities. So, for example, this theory has been used to analyze the death and tragic life of Marilyn Monroe, which you can read about. During her childhood, she was, her childhood was marked with abuse, parental neglect, and which supposedly, according to Adler, left her with many feelings of inferiority, and then led supposedly to this theory. I mean, there's way more to this. Like, obviously, I don't know enough about Marilyn Monroe to say, but sort of this idea that, okay, these feelings of inferiority led to all kinds of things like marrying celebrities, seeking adoration, all these things. And there's probably way more explanation to that than just this Adlerian perspective. But that's just kind of, okay, let's see how we can apply this and look at the lens. So these theories are important in terms of their contribution to understanding that there are maybe forces below the surface, unconscious forces that can have and influence our behavior. Internal conflict also may play some kind of role. Like there may be conflict that's bothering us, distressing us, that we're not even necessarily aware of. We do know the importance of childhood experiences. Those things can shape your personality, and people do in fact rely on defense mechanisms, especially to reduce their experience of unpleasant emotions like shame, guilt, things like that. It's been criticized, though. It's not really testable. It's not all that scientific. It's very vague. It's very difficult to measure. Relies way too heavily on clinical case studies, not necessarily on scientific samples, randomized samples, things like that. The hypotheses have been contradicted by actual, empirical evidence. So, and then also the theories themselves tend to be very male-centered, maybe even sexist view on personality. So this is more of a historical look at personality. It's not necessarily a look that we would want to use as a dominant framework in this day. So now we're going to move on historically and look at another theory that probably should ring a bell, and that is behavioral perspectives when it comes to adjustment, when it comes to personality. So we'll look at Pavlov and classical conditioning, Skinner and operant conditioning, Bandura in observational learning, and the strengths and weakness of each of those theories of personality. So behaviorism, kind of like psychodynamic theory, is just another perspective, and it really it focuses on how psychology can study observable objective observable behaviors, the things that we can directly measure. For example, we can see how people respond, their response tendencies to various various situations in their environment. And this has led to the development of different theories to explain how we respond, how do we adjust to our environment. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, which again, hopefully are a review. If you took my class for intro, then this is definitely a review. And Pavlov's classical conditioning, this is where we learn via association. For example, we learn to associate particular emotional responses, anxiety, phobias, things like that. But with enough exposure or counter conditioning, you can actually weaken that response to the point where it is extinct. So here's an example. Remember Pavlov, he conditioned his dogs to salivate whenever he would sound a tuning fork. So initially, when you sound the tuning fork, it is a neutral stimulus. It does not lead to any kind of response. And an unconditioned stimulus of food, of meat, if you present that to a dog, it leads to the dog slobbering. They salivate. Okay, what happens if we pair these two together? This is called the conditioning event. We're going to pair these two together. Ring the tuning fork, present the food. Ring the tuning fork, present the food. And eventually we get to the point now where the tone alone, the tuning fork alone, elicits the response of salivation. You combine those two events together. So we're taking a neutral stimulus initially, and we're creating a conditioned stimulus where the dog learns, oh, when I see the tuning fork or hear the tuning fork, then I get food, or I get the meat and start to salivate. Skinner, on the other hand, this is more about the previous theory is more about voluntary or involuntary behaviors. Skinner's theory on observation or operant conditioning is more about voluntary behaviors. And the gist of this is organisms will repeat responses that are rewarded, and they will typically avoid responses that are punished. That's the very gist of this theory. This is Edward Thorndike's, law of effect. And from that, he talked about, okay, well, there's different events that might shape our environment. So for example, reinforcement of any sort is always intended to increase a behavior. Positive reinforcement means I'm going to give you something to keep you doing that behavior. Negative reinforcement means I'm going to take away something that you don't like to get you to do your behavior. So maybe if your parents, if you got good grades on your report card and your parents said, hey, here's $20 for every A you got, that's positive reinforcement. But on the other hand, if they said, hey, for every A you get, we're going to take away a chore that you have to do this week. So you don't have to mow the yard. You don't have to do the dishes. We'll do it instead. That's negative reinforcement. They're taking something away to encourage behavior versus punishment. Punishment is always intended to weaken the behavior. It's intended to stop the response. So, if your parents said, hey, you're making bad grades and we're going to take away your Xbox, or we're going to, take away your cell phone, something like that, that's punishment. They're trying to get you to stop something. Reinforcement always encourages, punishment always discourages. So, here is another example. You might have, you're clowning around in class, you get some laughs, and that reinforces that you get attention. You decide, oh, well, my friends laugh at my jokes when I'm clowning around in class. I'm going to do that again next time there's a moment. Negative reinforcement, you decide, oh, I'm going to call in sick. Maybe you're not feeling that great. Maybe you have some anxiety and you decide, okay, I'm going to call in sick. You get to maybe you have a project or something coming up and you need some more time and you call in sick, and your boss buys it. You have some reduced anxiety. You're removing the anxiety, but the idea is both behaviors are being reinforced by the consequence. They're not, negative reinforcement is not punishment. The last theory when it comes to learning theory is Bandura's observational learning, and a lot of our personality is shaped simply by observing the world around us. I'm not saying that we copy everyone around us, but we are somewhat of, our personality is not only ours uniquely, but it's somewhat of an amalgamation of all the different personalities and things and traits we've been exposed to. We probably pick a little here, use a little here, and synthesize it into something unique of our own. But Bandura talked about observational learning, that kind of idea of monkey see, monkey do. That's a big way in which human beings learn, and that has a huge potential to shape our personality. So we tend to pay attention to others, their behavior. We also can see the consequence of their behavior. Like if we see a friend, gets rewarded or punished for a certain behavior, we know, hey, maybe I should do that or not do that. And we can store those experiences in memory and obviously use them for later. So, for example, you might watch a friend go to, they're buying a new car and you go with them and you see, oh, my friend is really good at negotiating with a car and they bargain and they don't back down and they don't, get pushed around by the salesman or whatever. And, you get to see them vicariously, bargain assertively and get a good deal. And, oh, well, hey, I'm either going to take this person with me next time, or I'm going to try some of the techniques I saw them do. So, and the idea is that through these experiences, through these learning experiences, we develop self-efficacy, which is simply our belief that we can do a specific, any specific task. It is task specific. So just because you have high self-efficacy in math doesn't necessarily mean you'll have high self-efficacy in learning language, but we know there's a lot of, positive outcomes for having high self-efficacy. For example, it's associated with your confidence, whereas having low self-efficacy tends to create self-doubt, and that's not good for a lot of things. It can also influence the kind of challenges you seek. So if you have high self-efficacy in math, for example, you're more likely to take more higher advanced level math classes. But if you have low self-efficacy in math, maybe you say, hey, I'm only going to take the one class I need to take, or X number of classes I need to take, and then I'm out, just as an example. So this theory is really cool. It has been credited for a lot of things. It is more grounded in empirical research than Freudian theory. It is much more thorough kind of account of trying to understand, consistencies in behavior. It has been criticized, though. It doesn't really, it doesn't necessarily embrace kind of the behaviorism. When we think about social cognitive theory, it's kind of it deviates from there. And then there's a lot of dependence, especially with operant and classical conditioning, of relying on animal research, which there's a time and place for that sort of stuff, but it's also important to kind of study these phenomena with actual humans too. Humanistic personality theory is very optimistic. It's a very glowing idea that people are capable of growth, people are capable of being their best self. And so you're going to be learning about Rogers and views on self-concept, Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and then the strengths and weaknesses of these different theories. And of course, hopefully this is familiar from intro, or maybe you've taken if you've even taken a personality class already, then bam, this is definitely familiar. But the idea behind humanism is that every single person is capable of growth. When we are in the right environment, psychologically, physiologically, et cetera, we can become the best versions of ourselves. When we're given the time to adjust properly to the world around us, we can really do some cool things, is what this theory is saying. We have an innate drive towards growth. We have free will to achieve that growth, and we are conscious, rational beings who are not dominated by the unconscious mind. So this is very much the antithesis to Freudian theory. And the first perspective I wanted to share with you is Rogerian theory, which is called person-centered theory. And it's the idea that at the center of your personality is this idea of yourself or self-concept. And it's all of your unique qualities, your nature, your nurture, your typical responses, all of those things. And ideally, we want our self to match up, our actual self, with our real self. We don't want a gap in between who we are and who we want to be. The larger the gap, this is where problems come about. But when we're much closer to who we think we are and who we want to be, there is this idea of congruency. But incongruency kind of undermines our sense of well-being when we say one thing and do something else. Or we this is the person I am, but this is the person who I want to be. If there's a big gap, it's not always good psychologically. So this idea of self-concept is very much at the center of personality when it comes to Rogers. All humans seek things like affection, love, acceptance, and those experiences, especially early on, when parents can give those needs to their children early on, is absolutely vital for development. So when parents make their affection more conditional, meaning dependent on the child feels, the child acts, then there's this idea of an incongruent self is more likely to develop. But when parents are able to exhibit unconditional positive regard towards their children, even when they make mistakes, even when they're human and they err, you're more likely to see better developmental outcomes, a more congruent self. So Rogers, whenever our self-concept is threatened, this is what leads to anxiety, leads to tension. And people who are more highly incongruent experience more anxiety. They tend to be more prone to anxiety. And then whether or not we feel congruent in terms of our self-concept is kind of the root of psychological health, how we adjust to the world around us. If we feel congruent or incongruent, can tell a lot about how we're going to adjust to the world around us, positively or negatively. So you might have an experience, a belief that your affection from others is conditional, leads you to distort shortcomings to feel worthy of affection, leading to a relatively incongruent self-concept, leading to more anxiety, which leads to defensive behavior. So there's the cyclical nature of how these incongruency can feed into itself, into anxiety, etc. So this is a kind of a comic depicting some of these ideas. Just remember, son, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose unless you want daddy's love. This is an example, kind of a humorous depiction of a conditional positive regard. Maslow, another humanist similar to Rogers, Maslow talked about human, obviously, we have certain needs that have to be met, and those needs are organized in a hierarchy that we try to prioritize the lowest needs first. But once our needs are met, according to Rogers, we can achieve personal growth through a process called self-actualization, fulfilling our fullest potential. And this is what that kind of looks like nowadays. Some new additions, I want to say cognitive and aesthetic needs are fairly newer to the chart, but we have initially our physiological needs, hunger, thirst, things like that. Then we have safety needs, belongingness, esteem, cognitive, like learning things, aesthetic, order, beauty, and then self-actualization, matching your fullest potential as a human being, whatever that might look like. So characteristics of self-actualizing people: they are more tuned into reality. They tend to be more open and spontaneous. They enjoy rewarding relationships, thrive in their work, have peak experiences, and tend to be more balanced personality, have a more balanced personality. So that's kind of concluding humanistic theory. It's a really good theory in terms of identifying the importance of self-concept, the importance of psychological health. Those are really important. Definitely lays the foundations for a newer school of thought called positive psychology that's bigger nowadays than probably humanistic psychology is. However, it kind of has some of the same problems that Freudian theory had. It's not always testable. Like, what does it mean to be self-actualized? Can we measure that objectively? Probably not. And it has maybe a more unrealistic, maybe too optimistic view on human nature, and sometimes lacks scientific evidence. So it's a cool theory to talk about, but maybe not the most scientifically grounded theory. Some more biological perspectives. This is getting into how we pass on traits, biologically. So I think how personality is passed on through genetic research, some evolutionary research on personality, and then the strengths and weaknesses of this perspective. Einstein is one of the more dominant name, or one of the bigger names you should associate with biological perspectives of personality, and this idea that your personality is just a hierarchy of various traits that we're passing from one generation to the next. It is a function of genetic differences called conditionability. So, and there's a lot of focus from Einstein on the extraversion, introversion variations when it comes to personality. And the idea behind this is that introverts more easily aroused by events, which makes them more easily conditioned than extroverts. So different personality traits might be more conditionable than others. And a lot of the research that goes into this is scientific, and it is more, maybe definitely more so than Freudian theory. And it's using twin studies, for example, looking at twins who have maybe been identical and fraternal twins who have been reared apart. You can really see the difference between nature and nurture when we try to look at the differences in personality, and we can develop what's called a heritability ratio. And that's just the estimate where we can look at variability and determine where is that variation coming from? Is it from genetics, or is it from environment? So twin studies, are really a really awesome tool for trying to understand this kind of role of nature and nurture. Identical twins are much more similar in their genetics than fraternal twins, especially on all five of the big five traits. Even when they're reared in different homes, even when we factor in this idea of the nurture side of things. So each of the big five traits is about 40 to 50% on this heritability ratio. Pretty large number. And this kind of gives rise to the evolutionary perspective when it comes to personality. And an evolutionary perspective is looking at, okay, how do certain ways of thinking and behaving, how has it led to our survival as a species? How is it, especially multiple generations, how does it lead to us thriving and surviving as a species? And so David Buss, for example, explored how the big five traits, have led to our ability to adapt and survive as human beings, our ability to organize as human beings, to those personality traits that allow us to grow in numbers rather than disperse, is a huge part of why we were able to survive for as long as we have. Daniel Nettle also talked about certain traits themselves are products of evolution from ancestral environments. So it's really tracing personality way back hundreds of thousands of years ago and looking at how the development of things like extraversion could have aided in our survival. So many of these perspectives have been, their assumptions have been supported by research. However, the biological perspective has been criticized. There are certain statistical problems when it comes to estimating heredity. It's not the most, it's not the most exact of sciences, I suppose. I'm not too familiar with the statistical procedures behind it, but that's not something I was necessarily trained in. And also, when we talk about evolutionary psychology, there is a bit of hindsight bias when we're talking about interpreting data from the past. Things aren't necessarily happening in the present. We might be sort of looking at them through the lens of the past, not always appropriately. So more contemporary approaches to how we understand personality. We're going to look specifically at the traits of narcissism and its effect on behavior. And then we'll also talk about terror management theory, how it relates to behavior. So there's a lot of growing interest in this personality trait of narcissism, and our textbook defines it as a trait where individuals have an inflated sense of ego or self-importance. They have a need for attention and admiration, and maybe also comes with a sense of entitlement. And this has been a growing phenomenon, probably more so in recent years, but really kind of took off in the 1980s when you could have, when scales were actually being designed to assess this personality trait. And so studies have shown that people who are, who score high on these narcissism personality traits, highly positive, but easily threaten self-concept. So they see themselves highly, but that's kind of like it's a house of cards, and their behavior is basically intended to keep that facade going. And then, that we're seeing also a trend and an increase in generational, in generations scoring high on these narcissism. You have two types: more grandiose and vulnerable. Like grandiose, high sense of self-worth; vulnerable, again, it's kind of that house of cards way of thinking about it. So terror management theory is, it's another way of thinking about personality, and it comes from several assumptions. The first, human thought or cognition is unique, and so unique that allows us to think about our own existence, our own mortality. We understand that our life is finite, and this leads to a great deal of anxiety. And so we engage in certain, cultural worldviews like religion, self-esteem, faith, things like that allow us to kind of deal with this sense of anxiety. And then looking at the world through the lens of, say, religion or spirituality, for example, gives us more order, context, and meaning to this somewhat chaotic world around us. And by simply reminding people of their own mortality, what in psychology we call that mortality salience, it actually will lead to an increase in self-esteem as a way to buffer that perspective that, oh my gosh, I might die, or I will die eventually. Culture also has a large factor, or plays a large part in personality. So we'll look at whether or not the 5-factor model has relevance outside of the US, outside of non-Western cultures, how research have found both cross-cultural similarities and disparities in personality, and then some research on culture and this kind of a saying of holier than thou. So cross-cultural comparisons allow us to see, okay, how do these different personality traits hold up across different cultures? So maybe that means we're comparing people in the United States to people in China, but we can also compare cultures within a country. So we compare people in the West to people in the East of the United States. We can compare people who live in rural areas versus, so it gives us this ability to see where does the consistency happen? Where do the comparisons and contrasts happen? So there is some variability, there is some variability across different personality traits across different cultural groups. And it probably has a lot to do with, obviously reflecting cultural influence on our personality. So beliefs about national character, which also can influence things like prejudice, can lead to, inaccurate stereotypes when they're investigated by researchers who are kind of looking at these cross-cultural comparisons. So you have to be really careful, check your biases at the door. Two kind of big cultural frameworks that psychologists look at. You have individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures tend to think about identity in terms of the individual, in terms of the self. Collectivist cultures tend to look at things more so as group dynamics. And depending on where you grow up, when you grow up, you may be exposed to more of an individualistic culture, more of a collectivist culture, and this can have profound impact on kind of the traits you display. So, we see differences, we see disparities and variations between these different cultures in terms of self-enhancement, whereas people from an individualistic culture are going to focus more on positive feedback, exaggerating their strengths, looking at themselves positively, that more so than collectivist cultures. Whereas in a collectivist culture, you're more focused on, hey, where are the shortcomings? How can I improve? How can I become a better member of this group? And so there's a little bit of spotlight on this phenomenon known as holier than thou, and it's this tendency for people to claim they are more likely to engage in socially desirable behaviors, like, hey, I'm more likely to recycle than my friends or this group of people, whatever. And there's some really interesting research from 2008 that looked at collectivist culture tend to promote greater self-insight than individualistic culture when they're contemplating whether or not they're going to engage in socially desirable behaviors. So, there may be a more honest reflection from a collectivist culture when it comes to this compared to individualistic cultures. Now, last thing we're going to look at is how do we assess personality? So looking at concept of standardization, test norms, reliability, validity, things that hopefully are familiar by now from intro psych, And then we'll also look at self-report inventories and projective tests, the two dominant frameworks for measuring personality. So a psychological test, whether we're talking about personality, IQ test, anything at all, this is a standardized measure of your behavior. Standardized meaning there is a uniform procedure to how the test is administered and scored. And ideally you adopt test norms. The comparisons are normed, meaning they are scored, not necessarily like on an IQ test. Getting 100 doesn't mean you have 100% right. The average score has been normed to 100. So if you scored 100 on an IQ test, that means you scored right smack dab in the middle of everybody else who took that test. You scored better than 50%, you scored worse than 50%. So that's what we mean by the scores are normed. The scores are compared to each other. Important concepts also, we would ideally like any assessment, a psychological assessment, to be reliable, meaning we get consistency in the measurement, and we want it to be we want our inferences to be valid, meaning we're measuring what we intend to measure. We're identifying the topic we're intending to identify. So here are some depictions of what reliability, something with high reliability, the scores are pretty consistent. Pam takes test 1 here, gets a higher score the second time, but it's not like this massively different. Same thing over here, but this is low reliability. We can see the scores are just all over the place. There's a wider degree of variation here. So when it comes to assessing personality, there are 2 types of personality tests. There's self-report inventories. So these are where you have a limited number of responses that are attempting to measure a very wide range of traits. You might see a question like, I like to read the Sunday paper, and you just say true or false. But obviously sometimes people will deliberately deceive on those kinds of events to answer in ways that are more socially desirable. Some examples of that: the 16 personality factor, the Neo inventory. So this is, for example, based on Costa McCrae's Big 5 personality traits. So more modern personality traits will tend to use this self-report method. And we can use these, for example, to map out and measure all kinds of. This is Cattell's inventory, his 16 trait factor inventory on these different scales. Projective tests are a little more tricky. This is where the individual will look at an ambiguous stimuli like a Rorschach ink blot test, for example, and they will project their personality onto the instrument by the way in which they respond to the instrument. So it's very difficult for you to deceive the instrument because they're so wide open, they're so subjective. And the idea is, okay, you look at this picture and you tell us a story, or you tell us what you see in the Rorschach, and it's kind of a window into the unconscious mind. So these tests are really interesting, but not very scientific, to be honest. Some common ones are the Rorschach ink blot test, which, you can Google any of these right now if you'd like. I guess this slide doesn't come with pictures, but the Rorschach and the thematic apperception test, the TAT, you look at a picture and you tell a story about what you see. And that is, both are supposed to be windows into the unconscious mind. So that wraps it up. This is sort of a look at how we can explain variations and how we all adjust to the world. That's chapter 2. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you around for chapter 3. Take care. Bye.